So the next key, and are you ready for this one? I always like to look at people's faces when I say this key. So the next key, key 6, is to take responsibility. Most people don't smile. Sarah's smiling, it's so nice. Most people don't smile when I say that one. They look at me like, haven't you given us enough to do already? Without like taking a big sandbag and putting it on our shoulders, because this is already exhausting and overwhelming. But I want to reframe the concept of responsibility for you. And I want to do it by telling you about another social psychology experiment. So maybe some of you have heard of this one, the Milgram experiment. How many of you have heard of the Milgram experiment? Okay, just a few of you. Good. So this experiment was conducted in the 1960s. It was at Yale. I don't know why all these experiments that are so famous are conducted at these big universities, but it was. And it was done by this man named Stanley Milgram, and he also paid people to participate in his experiment. And what he was studying was the effects of punishment on learning. So he offered to pay people. He had 2 come in at a time. Initially, he did it with just men, later repeated it with women. I can tell you about those results later, too. And so the men came in, and he had them draw straws to see who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. And so once their roles were clear, the learner was brought into a room and hooked up to electrodes to deliver electric shocks. Now the teacher got to see the learner being hooked up to this, and then the teacher was put into another room. And they couldn't see each other at that point, but they could hear each other. And the teacher was instructed, the teacher was put in front of a large console which had voltage and switches on it. And the voltages ranged from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt increments. At the one end, at the 15 volts, it said mild shock. At the other end, when it was 450 volts, it said severe shock. The last 2 voltage switches had XXX on them and danger. So what the teacher was told to do is to ask a series of questions to the learner, and if the learner got the question wrong, the teacher was supposed to press down one of the voltages, one of the shocks, and that would administer a shock to the learner. And then the teacher, if the person got it wrong again, was to move up, all the way up. So the experiment was actually not to test the effects of punishment on learning. The experiment was actually to test the effects of obedience to authority, because the learner wasn't actually getting shocked. It was rigged, the learner was an actor, and the whole thing was taped. So any response from the learner had a taped response for the teacher. There was a man in a white lab coat, the investigator, that was Dr. Milgram, and if the teacher was to become agitated at all about administering these shocks, that authority figure was to say, please continue. And he had a script as well. He said the exact things, please continue, we take full responsibility. Well, what happened was, as the learners were getting shocked, they would start to cry out in pain. If it went up further, they would complain about their heart condition. If it went far enough, they actually stopped speaking altogether. Now, prior to the experiment, the graduate students in the psychology department were asked, what percentage of people do you think will go all the way up to 450 volts? And they estimated that it will probably be about 1.5%. Right? Now, I think there are actually more sociopaths in the United States than 1.5%. But they actually believed that only 1.5% would go all the way up to 450 volts. Well, actually, 66% went up to 450 volts, thinking that they were harming, certainly, and perhaps killing the person in the other room. Okay, what does this have to do with taking responsibility? Well, one of the people who participated, they actually did, I told you they did this with women too, and they had the same results, so it didn't matter whether you were male or female. But they went back to all the participants to find out if they were glad that they participated in this experiment, and 92% were glad or very glad that they participated in this experiment, which I think is really interesting. Because, okay, how many people are in this room right now? Maybe 45, 50, something like that? Well, do the math. 66% of us would have done this, okay? We're not so special. We would have done this. So why would somebody be glad that they participated? Well, here's what one man said. And remember, this is back in the 1960s. Again, this was during the Vietnam War. When I was a subject, even though I believed that I was hurting someone, I was totally unaware of why I was doing so. Few people ever realize when they are acting according to their own beliefs and when they are meekly submitting to authority. To permit myself to be drafted with the understanding that I am submitting to authority's demand to do something very wrong would make me frightened of myself. I'm fully prepared to go to jail if I am not granted conscientious objector status. Indeed, it is the only course I could take to be faithful to what I believe. Okay, so this is somebody, oh, by the way, everybody went up to 350 volts. Okay, now what are our outlets? 120? Okay, and we know what that feels like. So everyone went up to 350 volts. So this man at least went up to 350 volts. And now he was ready to go to jail as a conscientious objector if he was not granted status and allowed not to participate in the war, not to be drafted. So what does that have to do with taking responsibility? I think that when we take responsibility, we actually take back our freedom. We take back our freedom from keeping up with the Joneses. We take back our freedom from advertisers who would tell us what we should do. We take back our freedom from any peer pressure. Maybe not any, but we take back our freedom to make choices based on our own values. So to me, the idea of taking responsibility is liberating. Take responsibility. Take responsibility for making a better world. Take responsibility for your choices. Your life will be enriched by doing so. You will be freer.